My name is Chris Hoklotubbe, and I am assistant professor of Cornell College, and I'm also a mixed settler and member of the Choctaw Nation. Uh, One of the ways in which I've been thinking about how my Choctaw identity informs how I read the Bible is to think about the experience of the Choctaw with Christian missionaries. And one of the experiences that's almost universal amongst Native Americans, right, is being seen as drunkards, as seen as lazy gluttons for whom are ripe to be civilized with the Christian message. And given this experience, my ears were perked when I came across this passage in Titus I would like to read from you. For there are also many insubordinate people, idle talkers and deceivers, especially those from the circumcision faction, whom it is necessary to silence, since they are overturning entire households, teaching what they should not for the sake of shameful profit. One of them, namely Cretans, their very own prophet said, quote, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts and lazy gluttons." This testimony is true. For this reason, rebuke these Cretans sharply so that they may become sound in faith, not giving heed to these Judean myths or to the commandments of those who reject the truth. So, in this passage, the author, as Paul, is describing Cretans as lazy gluttons, as wild beasts, as liars. Jews have this silly superstition of cutting their penises, of circumcision, and true followers of Christ are positioned as better than these people. And one of the stories that resonates from my own tradition comes from the story of Chief Hoklotubbe, who is a Choctaw chief, who was one of the chiefs who led the Choctaws across the Trail of Tears. When a Presbyterian minister came to demonstrate the value of education, a good American education for the Choctaw were initially open and they welcomed this education. And the Presbyterian minister came aside and pulled Chief Hoklotubbe aside and said, you know, we could do so much more for the Indians if only they would give up the bottle, if only they would give up alcohol. And Chief Hoklotubbe turns to this missionary and says, oh, if only I had the time and the resources to travel around your lands. I wonder if I might find as many drunkards on your streets as you claim to find in mine. So it has been part and parcel of missionary discourse to describe those who are being missionized or potential missionized as lazy gluttons, as alcoholics, as in need of the kind of virtue and civilization that the church can bring. I cannot help but hold these stories in my mind as I approach Titus. And certainly there has been a lot of hand-wringing, hand-waving when we approach this text that seems on the surface, according to modern sensibilities, somewhat racist, right? Commentators have said, well, he's not describing all Cretans, right? Because obviously there are some Cretans who can serve as leadership positions. Others have said, you know what? This is a hard truth, but this is the job of a good pastor. You have to talk about the sins of the people whom you're ministering. Otherwise, they are not going to improve. And still others have said, actually, there's a really fun paradox here. How do you take seriously the idea of a Cretan saying all Cretans are liars, right? This is an oxymoron, this is a paradox, and really what is happening is that this is a critique of the false teachers who are out there who are claiming to, have all this philosophical knowledge and impress people, and the author's just throwing all this under the bus, right? Wherever you go, you still can't get away from the fact that this text operates and assumes an ancient form of ethnic hierarchy, right? That is ultimately placing early Christians above Cretans and Judeans and Jews whom they are throwing under the bus. And so what I've been interested is, let's call a spade and just say this is awful. But nonetheless, also let's look into this and think about what this might be reflective of, what kind of social dynamics might be at work. And when we look at the 2nd century Roman Empire, we realize that there's this larger phenomenon called the Second Sophistic, in which to be Greek, to have Greek culture is really cool. It's really cool to speak in archaic Greek ways. It's as if Shakespeare all of a sudden became really cool, and the cool kids who are on the streets doing slam poetry are trying to out Shakespeare one another. And this is what's kind of happening in some competitive marketplaces in Greece. And so it's cool to have Greek heritage and culture, but it may be less cool to actually be Greek. But we see this in all the kind of benefactions that Hadrian is putting toward Greek culture. And so to be Greek, to excel in Greek culture has a kind of a symbolic value to it. I think something analogous is happening here with early Christians. And what the image I like to paint here is that to maybe imagine a Christian rolling up to a bar and seeing a few Romans and pulling up a bar stool and grabbing a drink, imagine Christians drink, right? And nudging his Roman neighbor and says, look at those guys over there, right? Gosh, man, those Greeks and those superstitious Jews, they're crazy. Good thing we're not like them, right? And as awful as this is a reality of attempts to negotiate a contested and imperfect colonial space. And this doesn't justify it by any means, but I think telling the story and thinking about these models are helpful for our imaginations. And so and I just said that how cool it is to be Greek, right? By throwing Greeks under the bus, by quoting something from the 5th century, by doing this deep dive to the Shakespearean like quote that says, oh yeah, we know Epimenides, right? We know their Greek culture, and we're going to use their Greek culture against them to show how cool we are, right? Is a really interesting move that's happening. And what we also know is when we look broadly, if we step back from the ancient Rome world, we look at situations from the modern world of how ethnic minorities are trying to navigate a culture where they want to look better in front of the dominant gaze, right? It seems to be that minority communities broadly, instead of forming allyships and say, you know what, let's team up together and let's give the finger to the empire, they turn on each other. Because there's a limited amount of cultural goods, there's a limited amount of positions, and this is empire building, right? To maintain a strong empire, you turn minority communities against each other, so they're more focused on their politics than they are on the actual dominant group that's dominating.